So, for the plenary, we originally had listed 5 speakers. Unfortunately, Mike Howlett can't be here. He's been called up for jury service in Canada and was not able to wiggle his way out of that. Otherwise, he would have been a really good contributor to this particular discussion. So we will have speaking this evening David Dolowitz first from the University of Liverpool, then Magdalèna Hadjiisky from the Université de Strasbourg, and then in a change of order we will go to Jennifer Spence, and then at the end we'll have Osmany, who will finish his presentation, I think, while he's sitting up there.
Oh, it was a secret.
So without further ado, let me ask David to come up and to let me remind you that it will continue with the tradition of taking written questions for people to respond to after they've spoken. Okay, so thank you, David.
I guess I should start by apologizing. I don't have PowerPoint slides, so I haven't joined the 21st century yet for this presentation. But, you know, that might be enjoyable. I really want to focus on just 3 aspects of structure agency. And I guess you would say that I fall into the line that I don't think structures or agency can explain everything, that really I sort of fall in the middle position, and I sort of think that it's the interaction of structure and agency that is much better at explaining things. Now, I say that, but I want to point out that ultimately, when legislation needs to be passed to implement a policy that is designed based upon what others have done, it's agents. Agents have to be the final legislator and the final implementer. But those agencies really are acting within a range of different structures that are forced upon them, or that they are embedded into and don't necessarily even realize that they're embedded in. So in the first sense, really when you're talking about policy transfer and you want to look at it in terms of structure agency, I think you need to be sort of clear about what kind of structures different agents are embedded in and how those structures might be shaping those agents. In the sense that if you think about it, agents are embedded in a range of structures, where those structures be based upon languages, whether they based upon the institutions they're working within, based upon the political systems they operate within, whether they're embedded in cultures at the UN, whether they're embedded in IMF cultures. Those structures are going to shape them. Now, they're going to shape them in the sense of the beliefs that they have, without a shadow of a doubt. They're also going to shape them in the kind of behaviors that are acceptable and not acceptable. And finally, different structures that they find themselves surrounded in are going to shape their abilities to act at any given moment. Now, if you think about it in terms of belief systems, most structures that surround you shape the beliefs that you have. It's called tacit knowledge. And most institutions, there's tacit knowledge that sits around and you don't really interact with very often until you come into contact with not following that tacit knowledge base. And so agents who are involved in transfer are going to have those tacit structures surrounding them as well, which will shape how they act. Now, the second point I want to make is that when you're discussing structures and agents, I think it's important to unpack the kind of different levels that agents are operating within, and how those different levels and the structures surrounding those different levels are going to affect both the policy making and implementation processes that the agents are involved within. So if you think about language-based networks, I suspect that language-based networks are going to be very important for sort of shaping the kind of information not only that you're looking for, but also the kind of information you're going to have. So if you're embedded into what is an Anglo or English-speaking network, you're probably not going to be interacting much with a Portuguese-speaking network. Thus, the information that you're going to be involved in transferring, or at least involved with coming into contact with in the first instance, is probably going to be very different. And so you've got to take those into consideration. At the same time, if you're thinking about a situation where discourse is associated with a given structure, so you have a discourse within Congress right now, and we know where the discourse within the US Congress lies, that discourse is going to shape how you view lessons. And so that is a form of structure that is going to surround you and shape your understanding of information. Now, what I find interesting is that if you find yourself embedded in one network and it's coming into contact with another network, a discourse network, when you're engaged in policy transfer, the lesson that you're taking away from something might not be the lesson that's being offered, because you're talking cats and the other person's talking dogs. And so if you're not aware of the fact that you're actually not, you're using the same words, but they mean different things, you're going to come into issues when it comes to trying to sell that on to any local agent that you're trying to deal with. Similarly, local agents might be operating with a very different discourse than an international agent. So when you're talking about the globalization literature, where the international is starting to interact directly with the local, often those international actors probably don't understand what the local actors are embedded in, and how those local actors and those local embedded structures are going to shape the ability of a local to utilize information, but also the kind of information that those local actors are going to be interested in. So that you might have a very interesting mismatch when you're going from international directly into the local systems. Now, when we're engaged with this, I think it's also important in which you think about how we, as researchers, interact with the discourse and structures of those discourse structures, in that often what we are looking for, we often find, but we might be finding what we're looking for because we're using a different discourse than the people we're interviewing are using. And so at times we are told what interviewees think we want to hear. And so their discourse is shifted to fit our discourse. And that is the structure of the interview setting which creates that. And so I think it's very interesting that when you're thinking about research methodology and how does this interact with structures and agents, is how do we correlate data and how do we triangulate data to make sure that what we hear is the same thing as what's really occurring, or that what we hear is the same meaning in which the agent is shifting that to us. This sort of brings up my third observation that I want to say about structure agency, and that is that one of the things that we're not good at discussing within the transfer literature when we're linking it to structure and agency, when it's linked, is that we're not very good at looking at time, timing, and tempo, and how time, timing, and tempo interacts with structures and agents. So if you're thinking about it, an agent might be empowered at one point in time due to the structures you're embedded in, but as the policy process progresses, that agent loses their power, and thus a new network or a new structure system kicks in. But we might be tracing it through the wrong agent if we're just looking at agents. Similarly, I think when you're talking about the factors, when you're looking at time, timing, and tempo, tempo can also be very important because some agents need to act fast because of the structural constraints they face. So if an agent faces a structural constraint that says we need to see results immediately, then the kind of data that they're going to be looking for is going to be very different than somebody who says I can stay in this process for a long time and I can engage with it for a long time. So again, that structurally embedded position is going to shape and be shaped by the time that policy processes take and also the tempo in which they're operating. And again, I think when you're talking about time, timing, and tempo and trying to interact that with structure agency issues. Not only are you looking at different levels of the structures that the agents are embedded in, but when you look at also the timing might be core and more important than necessarily the structure agency involved. And so if you're talking about moments of crisis, when you're talking about moments of crisis, those moments might empower certain agents, but if they don't have the speed in which they can act, or they don't have the right lesson, then that moment might disappear very quickly, and it might move into a different network. And so again, I think that it's very difficult to discuss agent or structure independently of each other. I think that if you want to understand impact and outcomes, I think that really what you need to do is start understanding how the two interact with each other, and particularly how they interact over time, because the networks that an individual is involved in will be shifting as the policy is moving along its process. And thus, the power of those agents, or what those agents are looking at or for, is going to be changing as the policy is moving along its process. So I just call for a dual approach rather than prefacing an agent or a structure, at least when you're looking at the transfer process. Thank you. I'm loud anyway. Diane, of course, asked the question that's not possible to answer. Diane's asking, are basically we creating structures that are limiting the ability of different views of the transfer process emerging, or are we creating structures that limit the way in which its policy transfer, diffusion, mobilities, I mean, however you really want to discuss it, is studied? Yeah, we are. It's called, that's what studies of professional studies do. We limit our views of the world in some ways. That's why you have a Kingdon policy-making model versus a Sabatier policy-making model. Those who follow the Kingdon approach generally won't follow the Martian Rhodes approach to policy-making. At the same time, I think one of the things that we're also doing, though, is because it's a relatively new in terms of the way it's being utilized. I mean, I think transfer's been going on forever. I think that we're still at a stage where it's flexible, and we're trying to create new methods to study it and incorporate existing methods to better study it. So I think that I have hope. Honestly, I have hope. And the only other thing I really want to stress is that I don't think we should limit ourselves to seeing structures as just physical or mappable things. I think structures are often invisible and not mappable, and I think we lose something if we forget the importance of structure. So social structure, as Magdalèna was talking about, it's not something you really see, and it's not something you're going to be able to map, but it's there, and it does structure, and it does influence how people view the world, or how we interact with information. And so these invisible structures that surround us, just like the tacit knowledge of organizations, I think if we forget how important that is within the study of transfer, I think we lose something. So I just encourage us on the belief that we need to expand, possibly. The structures are not viewed as just these mappable things, but that we understand what structures are and how they surround us on our daily lives, and thus they surround those who are engaged in any policy process.